It started as a typical evening. I had just finished a long day, exhaustion weighing on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The house was too quiet. My husband was still at work, my stepson in his room, or so I thought. I closed my bedroom door behind me, letting out a deep sigh as I peeled off my blouse, feeling the fabric slip away from my skin. And then, I felt it. That eerie sensation, the unmistakable presence of being watched. My heart stilled. A prickle ran down the back of my neck. I turned, and there he was, standing in the dim glow of the hallway, his silhouette barely visible against the frame of my slightly open door. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. How long had he been standing there? Had he just walked in, or had he been there the whole time? I scrambled to cover myself, the air between us thick with something I couldn't quite name. Shock. Confusion. Fear. He didn't move. Didn't speak. His face was unreadable. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My stomach twisted as a wave of unease crashed over me. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't a simple mistake. And in that moment, an even darker thought crept into my mind, a thought so disturbing, so impossible, that I tried to push it away. But I couldn't. Because this wasn't the first time I'd felt something off. And what happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. When Claire married Daniel, she told herself that love was enough. That the warmth of their shared evenings, the quiet understanding in his eyes, and the security of his presence would make up for the things she was giving up: her independence, her carefully constructed solitude, the certainty of a life she had controlled for so long. She had never pictured herself as a stepmother, had never imagined a home that already had its foundations built by another woman, by a past she wasn't part of. But love had a way of making people believe they could adapt. Daniel was a good man. Kind. Reliable. But he had spent too many years alone, too much time dedicating himself to his son, Ethan, after his wife's passing. And though he adored Claire, though he reassured her with tired smiles and brief touches, there was a part of him that always seemed just out of reach, like he had spent so long being a father first that he had forgotten how to be a husband. Ethan was polite. Reserved. Almost too much so. When they moved into the house, a house where Claire had changed nothing, where every picture, every piece of furniture had been placed long before she arrived, Ethan had greeted her with a handshake. Formal. Detached. He had called her Claire without hesitation, never stepmom, never anything that suggested she was anything more than a guest in his world. She tried. At first, she tried too hard. Making dinners, asking about his classes, attempting small talk when they crossed paths in the kitchen. He always answered, always nodded, but never invited conversation. He wasn't rude. He wasn't cruel. He was just distant. A ghost moving through the same halls, sharing the same space, but never fully acknowledging her presence. Daniel told her to give it time. That Ethan was adjusting, that he wasn't used to sharing his father's attention. And she believed him. Or tried to. But then, there were the small things. The way she would walk into a room and feel like someone had just been there, lingering just long enough to disappear before she could see them. The way she would set something down, a book, her phone, her keys, and find them slightly moved when she returned. The way the doors in the house never quite latched. The feeling that someone had just been on the other side, listening. One evening, she found herself in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of clothes when she came across a shirt that wasn't Daniel's. It was hers, one she hadn't worn in weeks, but it smelled different, faintly of cologne, of something unfamiliar. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers tightening around the fabric, before shaking her head and tossing it into the wash. It was nothing. Just her imagination. And then there were the looks. Ethan rarely met her eyes, but when he did, there was something there that unsettled her. Not hostility. Not resentment. Something else. Something unreadable. One night, she woke up suddenly, heart pounding for no reason she could name. The house was silent, dark, except for the faint sliver of light under the door. And then, a shadow. Someone moving. Pausing. She held her breath, waiting, listening. The shadow shifted, then disappeared. A few moments later, she heard the quiet creak of a door closing down the hall. In the morning, she told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was imagining things. But deep down, something had shifted. She was a guest in this house. An intruder in their lives. And no matter how hard she tried, she wasn't sure if she was being welcomed in, or watched from the outside. Claire shivered as she stepped inside, the rainwater dripping from her hair onto the hardwood floor. The storm had come out of nowhere, dark clouds swallowing the afternoon light as she rushed from her car to the house, fumbling with her keys, cursing under her breath when she dropped them in a puddle. Now, she was soaked. Her blouse clung to her skin, the fabric nearly translucent, revealing the outline of her bra. The denim of her jeans was heavy, sticking uncomfortably to her legs. Even her shoes squelched with each step as she hurried toward the bedroom, leaving a trail of water in her wake. The house was quiet. Daniel was still at work. Ethan, who knew where he was? Probably in his room with his headphones on, lost in whatever world he preferred over this one. Claire peeled off her blouse first, letting it drop to the floor with a wet slap. The cold air sent a shiver up her spine as she reached for the clasp of her bra, her fingers fumbling slightly from the chill. She exhaled, shaking out her damp hair, already reaching for the fresh clothes she had left on the bed. And then, the door opened. She turned so fast that her foot slipped against the wet floor. A sharp gasp left her lips as she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the dresser. Ethan stood in the doorway. The world shrank in an instant, silence pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the nightstand, the soft hum of the rain against the windows. For a second, just one strange, stretched out second, neither of them moved. Ethan's eyes widened, but he didn't step back. His hand was still on the doorknob, frozen in place, his body half in, half out of the room. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but had forgotten how. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her arms shot up instinctively, one crossing over her chest, the other reaching for the towel draped over the chair. But her movements were jerky, frantic, her fingers fumbling, grasping nothing but air. The moment should have been simple: an embarrassed yelp, a slammed door, an apology shouted from the other side. But it wasn't. Ethan didn't move. His eyes darted, flickering over her before he finally blinked, his expression unreadable. Not shock. Not embarrassment. Something else. Something Claire couldn't name, and it sent a slow, creeping unease through her stomach. Her voice came out too sharp, too breathless. Ethan. That single word seemed to snap something back into place. He exhaled, a quick, almost shaky breath, and his gaze dropped to the floor as he finally turned. His fingers clenched around the doorknob, knuckles white, but for a moment just before he pulled the door shut she swore she saw something flicker across his face. Regret. Frustration. Disappointment. And then he was gone. Claire stood there, heart hammering, skin flushed with more than just embarrassment. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the towel against her chest, breath coming in uneven gasps. It had been an accident. It had to have been. But then why hadn't he looked away sooner? Why hadn't he moved at all? And why, standing there now, alone in the silence of her bedroom, did she feel like something had just changed between them, something subtle, something unsettling, something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand? Claire told herself it was nothing. An awkward moment. An accident. A split-second mistake that had been rectified the moment Ethan shut the door behind him. These things happened. People walked in on each other. Life moved on. But something had shifted. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The way Ethan lingered just a little too long in a room after she entered. The way his eyes flicked toward her when he thought she wasn't looking. His expressions were unreadable, half-formed, something withheld just behind his gaze. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but she felt it. Conversations changed, too. Before, he had been distant, answering her questions with as few words as possible. Now, there was something else in his tone. You look different today, Claire. Are you cold? You're shivering. You smell nice. What is that? Each phrase was harmless on its own. Just words. Just conversation. But something in the way he said them, in the way his voice dipped low, in the way his lips curled slightly at the corners, made her stomach tighten. She started catching him in doorways. Standing just outside the living room while she folded laundry. Pausing near the kitchen while she washed dishes. Close enough to be present, far enough to make it seem accidental. But she could feel his eyes on her, could sense the awareness radiating from him. One evening, while Daniel was working late, Claire sat curled on the couch with a book, determined to shake the feeling, to convince herself it was all in her head. Ethan entered the room without a word, sinking into the chair across from her. She forced herself to stay focused on the pages, to act natural, even as she felt his gaze settle on her. Minutes passed. When she finally looked up, he didn't glance away. His expression was neutral, his body relaxed, but his eyes, there was something there. Something heavy. Her throat went dry. "Did you need something?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. A slow smile. "No." He didn't move. She turned back to her book, but the words blurred together. The air felt thick, pressing against her skin. Later that night, as she changed into her nightclothes, she hesitated before shutting her bedroom door. She had never felt the need to lock it before. It was just her and Daniel. And Ethan. Her stepson. She shook her head, exhaling sharply. This was ridiculous. She was being ridiculous. But then, a few nights later, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Soft. Measured. Just outside her door. She held her breath, listening. The steps paused. Then a shift, like someone turning. A long silence. Then retreating steps. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. She never heard his door close. The next morning, she asked him casually if he had been up late. If he had walked through the hall. He smiled, tilting his head slightly. "No." "Why?" She studied him. His face was open, unreadable. Innocent. Too innocent. The next few days, she tried to pretend everything was normal. She cooked dinner. She watched television with Daniel. She smiled when Ethan entered the room, making herself believe this was all in her imagination. But then she found her perfume bottle on the bathroom counter, its cap off, when she was sure she had left it in the drawer. Then a sweater she had worn the week before appeared on the back of the couch, though she knew she had put it away. Then the door to her room, which she had started shutting each night, was open one morning. Just an inch. Just enough. She felt herself unraveling, felt the creeping dread curl its way around her spine. She could tell Daniel, but what would she even say? That Ethan looked at her differently? That he lingered? That things were being moved? She could already hear the response. "You're imagining things. He's just getting used to you. He's a teenager, they're strange." Maybe he was right. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe this was all one long coincidence. But then, one afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, she felt it again. The weight of eyes. She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. She inhaled sharply, gripping the knife a little too tight. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled. He didn't answer right away. Just smiled. "No," he said. Then he walked away. And Claire was left standing there, gripping the knife, her heart hammering, her skin crawling, knowing without a doubt. She wasn't imagining it. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the rain against the windows. The storm had rolled in just after sunset, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. Claire sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty wine glass in front of her. The bottle sat nearby, condensation forming on the dark green glass. Daniel was late. Again. She had called him earlier, had heard the usual apology in his voice, the distracted way he promised he wouldn't be too long. She hadn't even asked why this time. She already knew the answer. Work. Always work. She exhaled, rubbing her temple. The frustration was familiar, but tonight it felt heavier. She barely heard the footsteps until he was already there. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her. His hair was damp, curling slightly at the ends, his t-shirt loose, his frame just slightly too lean to belong to the boy he had been only a year ago. Drinking alone. His voice was casual, but there was something in his tone, something knowing. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 10. "I suppose I am." He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "Rough day." She almost laughed. He didn't know. Couldn't know. But his eyes told her something else that maybe he did. She picked up the glass, swirling the wine before taking a sip. "Your father is working late." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "He usually does." She looked at him then, properly, her gaze meeting his. He wasn't wrong. She pushed the bottle toward him. "Do you want some?" He hesitated for only a moment before reaching for it, pouring a small amount into the glass in front of her. He didn't have his own, but he lifted the glass anyway, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. Claire should have stopped him. She should have said something. But she didn't. Instead, she watched the way he licked the drop of wine from his lower lip, the way his eyes flicked to her mouth before looking away. A beat of silence passed between them, stretched too thin, too fragile. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You seem tense," she scoffed, shaking her head. "That obvious?" He smirked. "A little." The air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. She should get up. She should go to bed, leave the room, do anything but sit there under his gaze, feeling something she shouldn't be feeling. But she didn't move. He tilted his head slightly. "You ever get tired of it?" Her throat tightened. "Of what?" He didn't blink. Waiting for him. Something deep in her chest twisted painfully. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. "Ethan, I see you, you know." His voice was softer now, quieter. "I see how lonely you are." Her pulse kicked up, her breath catching in her throat. She shook her head, forcing a smile, something light, something dismissive. "That's not." But she stopped. Because suddenly, he was closer. He had leaned forward, his arm resting on the table, fingers only inches from hers. His gaze didn't waver. Claire swallowed hard. This was wrong. This was beyond wrong. And yet, her skin burned where his eyes lingered, her body betraying her even as her mind screamed at her to move, to break the moment before it became something else. Ethan's fingers brushed hers, barely a touch, just the lightest graze of skin on skin, and it was enough. Enough to send a shiver down her spine. Enough to make her breath hitch. Enough to make her pull her hand back so fast that her wine glass tipped, spilling dark red across the table. The spell shattered. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I should go to bed." Her voice was too shaky, too rushed, too obvious. Ethan didn't move, didn't break eye contact. For one agonizing second, she thought he might say something, that he might acknowledge what had just happened. But then he leaned back again, exhaling slowly. "Good night, Claire." Her stomach twisted at the way he said her name. She turned and left, her heart pounding, her pulse loud in her ears, the warmth of his touch still burning on her skin. She told herself it was nothing. But deep down she knew. A line had been crossed. And there was no going back. Claire sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white. The air in the house felt thick, pressing in from all sides. The silence was unbearable. The weight of it settled on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had spent the entire day rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain everything before it spiraled any further out of control. She would tell Daniel the truth, all of it, before Ethan had the chance to twist it into something else. But she was too late. Daniel stood across from her, arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of anger and something worse, uncertainty. And Ethan leaned against the wall, silent, watching, his expression carefully measured. There was no trace of hesitation, no flicker of guilt. Claire swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he tell you?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "He told me enough." She shook her head. "Daniel, please." He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound cutting through the air like a gunshot. "I trusted you, Claire. I let you into this house, into my family. And this," he gestured wildly, as if trying to find the words, but all that came out was a bitter laugh. "This is what you do." Claire's stomach dropped. The room felt like it was tilting, like the ground beneath her was giving way. "Tell me exactly what he said," she demanded, her voice stronger now, fueled by something dangerously close to panic. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing like a man trying to hold himself together. "He said you've been making him uncomfortable for weeks. That you've been," he stopped, exhaling sharply. "That you've been inappropriate." The word sent a cold spike of horror through her. She turned to Ethan, heart hammering, disbelief crashing over her like a tidal wave. "You're lying." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his lips parting just enough to let out a shaky breath, like this was difficult for him, like he was the victim. His performance was flawless. "I didn't want to say anything," he murmured. "I thought I could handle it. But last night," he looked away, shaking his head. "I couldn't pretend anymore." Claire's mind reeled. "What are you talking about? What happened last night?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he lowered his gaze, playing his role perfectly. Daniel turned to her, eyes burning with accusation. "Did you touch him?" The question knocked the air from her lungs. "Are you serious? Answer me." "No," she spat. "I would never. You know me." Daniel let out a hollow laugh. "Do I? Because right now, I don't know what to think." Claire pushed up from the table so fast the chair scraped against the floor. She pointed at Ethan, her hand shaking. "He's manipulating you." Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Ethan saw it too. "I didn't want to ruin anything," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know she makes you happy. But I can't live like this anymore." Claire's entire body went cold. He was good. Too good. She could see it in the way he hunched his shoulders just enough to look vulnerable. The way his eyes glistened, as if he were holding back tears. The way his voice trembled at just the right moments. Daniel turned to her, and in that moment she knew. She had already lost. The doubt was there, etched into the lines of his face. She shook her head, desperate now. "Daniel, please. He's lying." Daniel exhaled sharply, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "I don't know what to believe." Ethan lowered his head, voice barely audible. "I just want to feel safe in my own home." Something inside Claire snapped. She took a step toward Ethan, and for the first time, she saw it the flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had won. She turned back to Daniel, voice raw, breaking. "You can't actually believe this." But she could see it now. The decision was already made. Daniel swallowed hard. "You need to leave." Claire's breath caught. "What?" "Just for a while. Until we figure this out." Tears burned in her eyes. "Figure what out? You think I would do this?" Daniel didn't answer. That silence was worse than anything he could have said. She felt the floor drop out from under her, the walls closing in. Ethan kept his gaze lowered, but she could feel his satisfaction radiating through the air like a slow-burning fire. Claire inhaled sharply, pressing her lips together, forcing herself not to shatter completely. She turned, walking to the door with numb, mechanical movements. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her coat. She hesitated, one last time, praying that Daniel would stop her. That he would see through the lie. That he would believe her. But he didn't. She stepped out into the cold night, the door shutting behind her with a final resounding click. And she was alone. Claire sat in the motel room, the hum of the neon sign outside casting a faint red glow against the wall. It had been weeks since she left the house. Weeks of loneliness, of doubt, of replaying every moment over and over in her head, trying to understand how it had all gone so wrong. Daniel hadn't called. Not once. But she wasn't crying anymore. She was done crying. She had spent every sleepless night digging. Through old messages, through school records, through anything she could find. And now, in her hands, she held the truth. The file was thin but damning. Printed emails, old disciplinary reports, a police statement from another town. A different family. A different woman. Ethan had done this before. A stepmother. A fabricated accusation. A father caught between love and doubt. And a woman cast out while Ethan remained untouched, the golden boy, the victim. Claire's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages one last time. It was all there. The same tactics. The same quiet manipulations. The same cold, calculating precision. She wasn't his first. But she would be his last. The house was dark when she arrived. She had been careful, waiting for Daniel to leave, waiting for the moment when she knew Ethan would be alone. She let herself in with the key that Daniel never thought to take from her. The familiarity of the space sent a sharp pain through her chest, but she pushed it aside. Ethan was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch, headphones on, oblivious. She watched him for a moment, a strange sense of calm settling over her. Then she stepped forward. He saw her in the reflection of the TV screen before he heard her. His body stiffened, shoulders tensing as he pulled off the headphones and turned. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't look smug. He looked startled. Claire held up the file, letting it dangle between two fingers. "Recognize this?" Ethan's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward the door, calculating. "You shouldn't be here." She tossed the file onto the coffee table. The papers fanned out, exposing names, dates, accusations. "You did this before," she said. "To someone else." His expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker in his eyes, the brief hesitation before his mask slipped back into place. "You're grasping at straws," he said smoothly. "Daniel won't believe you." Claire let out a slow breath, her pulse steady, her hands no longer shaking. "He already does." She watched the confidence drain from his face. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head, but it wasn't as easy for him now. She could see the cracks forming. Claire stepped closer. "I sent everything to him an hour ago. He's on his way home." Ethan blinked, his throat working as he swallowed. For the first time, he looked young. For the first time, he looked afraid. She leaned in, voice calm, steady. "It's over." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, caught between fight and flight. And then, slowly, deliberately, she turned and walked away, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his own making. As she stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin, she let herself breathe. It was over. But as she reached the car, a final thought settled into her bones, cold and certain. She wasn't the first woman he had done this to. And if she hadn't stopped him, she wouldn't have been the last. Sometimes, the truth is far more twisted than fiction. Betrayal isn't always loud. It doesn't always come crashing through the door, screaming and throwing accusations. Sometimes, it's quiet, calculated, woven carefully into the spaces between words, into glances that linger too long, into the slow unraveling of trust until you're left questioning your own reality. This story wasn't just about infidelity. It was about deception, power, the dangerous game of manipulation played behind closed doors, where the most innocent-seeming actions can carry the darkest intentions. It was about what happens when love is weaponized, when the people we trust the most become the very ones who dismantle our lives piece by piece. But the real question is, how often does this happen without anyone ever knowing? How many lies go undetected? How many lives are shattered in ways that never make it to the surface? And when faced with the impossible choice between trusting someone you love and believing a truth too disturbing to accept, how do you ever know which is right? If this story shook you, if it made you question what you thought you knew about loyalty, relationships, and the hidden motives lurking beneath the surface, then you're not alone. These are the stories people don't talk about. The ones that stay buried because they're too uncomfortable, too unsettling. But we're bringing them to light. So now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever seen manipulation unfold in a way that left you speechless? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because these conversations matter more than we realize. And if you want more stories that dive deep into the shocking, the heartbreaking, and the utterly unthinkable, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next, because trust me, there's always more than meets the eye. Thank you for watching. Stay aware. Stay questioning. And most of all, stay safe.